Warm welcome to everyone here to tonight's forum on Australia's climate policy, effective or greenwashing. My name is Kylie McIntosh and I'm President of the Bayside Climate Crisis Action Group, or BCAG for short, one of our 3 local host organisations. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land and the waters around where we meet, and whose sovereignty has never been ceded. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Our format this evening, so we're going to have our keynote speaker, Polly Hemming, speak first, followed by our MPs, Dr. Michelle Ananda-Rajah, then Josh Burns, and then Zoe Daniel has pre-recorded a video which will be playing this evening too. We'll then open the floor for questions from the audience, and finally our organising groups have drafted a short resolution which we'll display on the screen, and we'll ask you, our audience, to vote in support of that resolution. So a couple of words on our host organisations. BCAG is a not-for-profit community group who've been working in the Bayside area for over 15 years to reduce the impact of climate change and promote sustainability through raising community awareness and working constructively with all levels of government to advocate for strong action on climate change, such as helping to bring about Bayside Council's climate emergency declaration in 2019 and Council's subsequent commitment to a community-wide strong emissions reduction target of 75% by 2030. The Port Phillip Emergency Climate Action Network, PCAN, is a network of 12 climate action groups and individuals in the Port Phillip area that aims to create and sustain a strong climate action movement in Port Phillip. Port Phillip's Bayside location makes it especially prone to the impacts of the climate emergency, and its citizens are also amongst Australia's most progressive when it comes to recognising the climate crisis and issues of environmental sustainability. And GCAN, the Glen Ira Emergency Climate Action Network, is a non-partisan collective of community groups, citizens and supporters who are pursuing an agenda of climate justice through actions and by influencing decision-making across all levels of government and from within the community. GCAN are currently engaged in a plastics campaign calling for a reduction in the use of soft plastics and a Save the Southern Lake at Caulfield Racecourse Reserve campaign, where the Melbourne Racing Club and the Racecourse Reserve Trust plan to destroy the lake in favour of plans for an underground car park, synthetic playing fields and a maintenance yard. GCAN have petitions in the foyer for those of you who wish to lend their support to those campaigns. Now, last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released its latest synthesis report, which scientists have described as a final warning. While the report is pretty dire, it's clear that there is so much that we, and by we I'm referring to our global society, can do to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. One of the standout key messages is that rapid and far-reaching transitions across all sectors and systems are necessary to achieve deep and sustained emissions reductions and secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The UN Secretary-General summarised this pretty well by saying, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts. Everything, everywhere, all at once." Sounds a bit like a title for a movie too. So the challenge for our government is, of course, getting emissions down and getting them down fast. Tonight, we're going to hear about Australia's new climate policy, the amended safeguard mechanism, about the use of carbon credits within the policy, and really to what extent should we rely on them? How do we ensure the integrity of carbon credits? How do we ensure that the policy will work as intended? Where is Australia at on emissions? And what does climate integrity look like? So now I am delighted to introduce to you Polly Hemming, who has kindly travelled here to be with us today from Canberra. Polly is the Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program and has extensive experience working in policy, marketing and engagement roles in both the not-for-profit and public sectors. Polly's current work focuses on carbon and environmental markets, climate integrity and greenwashing. Thank you, Polly, and over to you.
Which one? Okay. Every time. Thank you. Thanks, Kylie. Thank you so much for having me, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for making time out of your... It's Tuesday evening, isn't it? Make time out of your Tuesday to be here. Thank you to our two MPs that have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here. I think it shows a commitment to how important this issue is. So the title of this event, how's that sound? It's okay? Cool. The title of this event is called Australia's Climate Policies, Effective or Greenwashing. So obviously I'm going to give you a more detailed answer, but up front I just want to set the scene for you, and my hope is tonight that you can actually decide for yourself whether our climate policies are effective or whether they're greenwash. So as you're aware, and as Kylie alluded to, our key climate policy... Thank you. Yeah. Oh, my face, yeah. That's better. Sorry. It's just life for me, having... Yeah, perfect, thank you. As you're aware, Australia's key climate policy, our flagship climate policy, the safeguard mechanism, was debated and passed in Parliament around 2 weeks ago. So this is our flagship climate policy. It's been passed. The climate wars are over. We're one step closer to meeting Australia's climate target. Except literally days after the safeguard mechanism was debated and passed, the government released its Resources and Energy Quarterly Update, and this is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a forecast of volumes and prices of Australia's resources and energy commodities. And what that update says is that Australia's coal exports will be increasing through to 2028. And our LNG exports, which since 2009 have almost quadrupled, they'll be steady through to 2028. So 2028 is 8 years into the so-called critical decade for climate action. We're already 3 years into the critical decade, and we're still saying now, 3 years in, that we're going to be increasing our fossil fuel production. So at face value, if a country's not doing anything to address the number one thing that is making the climate crisis worse, does it really have effective climate policies? So it's almost a year since the government won the 2022 election, and I'm in full agreement. We have had a decade of almost criminal delay, though to be clear, it's not because the Greens voted against the CPRS in 2009. If I'm frank, as a citizen and a voter and a parent and an aunt, I'm genuinely very fearful that when it comes to climate, Australia is setting off on a course that is very similar to the one that was set by the Coalition. And I'm very mindful that there are two members of Parliament here, both of whom whose work I know, who I have respect and admiration for. I don't envy the job of politicians, especially when it comes to climate policy, especially during the critical decade, especially when the job is so urgent and the cuts must be so deep. That's not a job that I want to take on. As I said, I'll present the information. You can decide ultimately whether Australia's climate policies are up to scratch. So first of all, I'm just going to give you an overview of where we're at in terms of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. Then I'll tell you where we're going, and then I'll talk about the policies that we have to address those. So what I'm going to do up front is just give you a bit of a background, and it's a bit dry. It's probably stuff you've heard before, but I'm just going to ask for you to bear with me because it's really important, and actually it's going to, for those that don't know, it will help you assess yourself when you hear claims made about emissions reductions by a state or federal government, how legitimate they are or what's sitting behind them. I was actually going to put up some graphs tonight, but decided this afternoon at 6:30 on a Tuesday, which I'm now confident it is, that I don't think any of us need that in our lives right now. So I'm going to keep it at a really high level. In December last year, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, gave the government's first annual climate change statement to Parliament. And this is a progress report that was one of the commitments made by the Labor government when they were elected, along with the new commitment to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 compared to what they were in 2005. And in his statement, Minister Bowen said that Australia has been decarbonising its economy at a rate of about 12 million tonnes of carbon per year since 2009. And that actually sounds like a pretty good figure. That suggests that Australia's emissions have actually fallen by about 22% since 2005. And that means that, thanks to Scott Morrison largely, we're already about halfway to that 43% target. And that's not bad for a country that has had no climate policies for the last decade and that has been rampantly pursuing fossil fuel production. However, what this figure doesn't accurately capture, well, it doesn't actually accurately capture Australia's climate achievements. Emissions may have fallen, but language really matters here. Australia's economy hasn't been decarbonising. What's happened is we've actually just got kind of lucky with the weather and the way that we do our climate accounting. So when Australia reports its emissions internationally, it does so in the form of what's called an inventory. And this is basically what you'd expect it to be. It's a big list of all our human-managed sources of greenhouse gas emissions, like factories, coal-fired power stations, agriculture, everything that humans are responsible for. It adds that up. You get totals for each sector, and then it adds them up. It also compiles a big list of what are called sinks, and these are what they sound like. They're things that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're plants, basically, human management of plants and trees. And we all know plants suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. So theoretically, these sinks can sometimes balance the things that we're putting out into the atmosphere. I'm sorry if this sounds basic, but just stay with me. So including land sinks in climate reporting is pretty questionable. There's always been controversy over it since the Kyoto Protocol, but it's what we're stuck with, so we go with it. Anyway, what Australia's done is essentially gamed the idea of sinks in its climate accounts. And this is how it can say emissions have dropped since 2005. Not decarbonised, emissions may have fallen, not decarbonised. And basically what it did is, in about 2015, I think it was choosing a year to measure emissions against. And it deliberately chose a year. So there's no law or international rule that says we have to have 2005 as a base year. But 2005, coincidentally, was a year of really high emissions thanks to rampant land clearing in Queensland. And so Australia was sort of, I'm not sure if this is how it went down, but looking at the years that would make Australia look best, and chose 2005. It says it's so it can compare with the US and Canada, but it's just a coincidence that that happened to be a really high year of emissions. And it also knew what happened after that, and that was that there was a state-based policy in Queensland that temporarily stopped land clearing. So of course emissions dropped. You stop cutting down the trees, emissions are going to drop. Then what happened after that is that we had the millennium drought. And so a lot of cows and sheep died. We stopped using so much fertiliser. Then we had a whole lot of rain with La Niña, and trees grew. We had a whole lot of woody vegetation, so of course that's sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then we had COVID, and people stopped flying. And so our transport emissions dropped, and some steel production, I think, dropped. So none of these things have anything to do with climate policy. Essentially, the government, or for Scott Morrison, was taking credit for rain and a global pandemic. But to say now, we've been decarbonising at a rate of, 12 million tonnes a year, is just not true. It's not illegal, and it's not against the rules, the way that Australia does its accounts, but to be clear, it hasn't decarbonised the economy. What it's doing is masking a lack of decarbonisation. It's also, as I said, generally accepted that land sector emissions are really uncertain, prone to reversal, hard to measure. A lot of countries just don't actually report their emissions with the land sector. And Australia's been accused of cheating in the past, and in fact, I think a couple of years ago, the Norwegian government or the Norwegian ambassador to Canberra said that they don't include the land sector in their accounts because it would make it too easy to meet reduction targets. But it's like at school when your teachers say, if you cheat, you're only cheating yourself. And actually this turns out to be true because I did 6 years of French with very high marks and I cannot speak a word of French. This accounting might seem like Australia is on a good path, but when you take away those incidental drops from our accounts, I'm not saying the drops didn't happen, but Australia's emissions from fossil fuel combustion and production and other sectors of the economy, they've only fallen by about 2% since 2005, not 22%. And that's mainly across the electricity sector. We've had really good gains there, but this means we haven't decarbonised transport, waste, industry, manufacturing, agriculture is now bouncing back. So that's where we're at. We've got a lot of work to do. Now, where are we going? What are we doing to address this? So along with its climate inventory, the government releases every quarter. It also releases something annually called the climate projections. And this is what it expects emissions to do in the future. It's all modelled and it's based on sets of assumptions, so it's not set in stone. But if you look at the government's projections that were released at the same time that Minister Bowen did his climate statement in December last year, through to 2030, transport emissions, industry, fugitive emissions, that's the emissions from extracting fossil fuels, fugitive emissions and from fossil fuel production, they're all staying steady. That's at a baseline, business as usual scenario. Then what the government does is it lays its climate policies over the top and says what the impact of those will be. And with the government's policies, emissions do drop. It's mostly over the electricity sector. And there is a bit of a drop across other sectors, but I can't actually tell you how that happens and what they are. There's an aggregate figure, but in a Senate inquiry recently, government representatives said, no, we didn't model that. There is a drop, but we can't tell you what sectors it's occurring in. You know, I'd hazard a guess it's industry, but they haven't released that publicly at least. And to be clear, even when the government's policies are implemented in these projections, it still doesn't get us to 43%. What isn't in those projections is the fact that Australia is still planning on being a major fossil fuel exporter. So I'm just going to grab a drink. We're already the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. There's no indication, or has been no indication, that the government is going to stop the $11 billion a year in subsidies that go to fossil fuels. And our climate minister, Chris Bowen, recently said when the safeguard mechanism was being debated that a ban on new gas and coal projects would be irresponsible. So as I said earlier, the government's own data says that coal exports are going to increase through to 2028. And of course, LNG is going to stay the same after having almost quadrupled since 2009. Then of course, there's the government's own resources major project list. And on that, this is department language, there are 116 new fossil fuel projects listed as in development. And if these were all to go ahead, and yes, I know not all of them will go ahead, but our estimates were conservative. This was prior to the safeguard, admittedly. Those new projects, the burning the gas and coal, or producing, so domestically and internationally, they would result in about 4.8 billion tonnes of CO2 through to 2030. And that's a really abstract figure. Like that, to me, I can't conceive of that. It's like saying a gajillion tonnes. That's about the equivalent of having 215 coal-fired power stations going every year. So we've got 10, about 10 in Australia, and we're trying to furiously shut them down. 215. So yes, most of this gas and coal will be exported, but even if we talk about the direct emissions here in Australia, the research from the Australia Institute showed that direct emissions onshore, the ones that we count, will result in about 164 million tonnes of onshore CO2 equivalent through to 2030. And for context, the safeguard mechanism is meant to achieve a reduction of 205 million tonnes by 2030. So these new projects can potentially wipe out a majority of that reduction. Ugh. So what are we doing to address this? What climate policies do we have in place? We do have some climate policies. Are they effective? So when we're talking about Australia's climate policies, we're talking about the domestic context, things that clean up our electricity grid or maybe manufacturing. But big picture, they're not doing anything, as I said, to address the number one thing driving climate change, which is fossil fuel expansion. And it actually doesn't matter how many good things you do if you're not stopping the bad things. If you're still if you're still endorsing and funding those bad things, if you're still defending those bad things, it doesn't matter how much sugar you add to a cake that is made with rotten eggs. Cake might get bigger, but it's still going to make you really sick. So we're a global citizen, and what we do does matter. This is science. This is not opinion, this is science. It matters that we're planning on exporting billions of tonnes of emissions to the rest of the world, because actually climate change, or the climate change our exports are driving, isn't very respectful of geographic boundaries. It isn't respectful of international accounting protocols. It isn't respectful of the terms scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. It isn't respectful of government talking points. The emissions that we export, the gas and coal we export, very much are our problem and our responsibility, because the floods and fires that they cause, the existential threat to our Pacific neighbours, and we talk about being a good neighbour to the Pacific, they very much are our problem. And the argument, if other countries want to buy our gas and coal, then who are we to stop them, just doesn't stack up. Because for decades, our governments on both sides have been out there using foreign policy to make sure there is a market. We're not passive in this. We've been securing markets, including a recent government trip to India. We don't whale anymore, even though I'm sure there's demand for whales. We stopped mining asbestos, even though I'm sure there would be demand for asbestos. We don't sell alcohol to kids, even though kids are busting to get their hands on alcohol. We don't do it because it's the right thing not to do it, because it harms people. So to get back on track, Australia's main climate policies at a federal level are, of course, the safeguard mechanism and the government's goal of 82% renewables in the grid by 2030. And there are some other funds and policies, and I believe there is an electric vehicle strategy being announced tomorrow, and I'm sure Josh and Michelle will elaborate on other policies in place, but these are the two that are sort of most substantive, and that the projections... 2 minutes. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, I'll keep it quick. So on the renewables plan, getting more renewables into our electricity grid, and it's electricity we're talking about here, not the broader energy system. That's a really good thing. The government's goal is really commendable, and there's $20 billion for the upgrade of the electricity grid so it can handle more renewables. And that's nothing to be sneered at. Unfortunately, there's uncertainty about whether we'll actually get to that 82% target. And even if we do, if we want to be a processor of critical minerals, of a hydrogen superpower, if we want to decarbonise our transport and manufacturing, then 82% is not going to be enough. And then, of course, there's the safeguard mechanism. Do I need to recap really quickly what that is? Most people know. Well, it's got shaking and nodding. Okay, so it's meant to just 200 of Australia's biggest polluters. They're arbitrarily grouped. They're from across all sectors of the economy. The only thing they've got in common is that they pollute above a certain amount every year. And they have to stay under this pollution limit. And what the government is doing is basically lowering that pollution limit every year. They have to stay under that. They don't have to reduce their absolute emissions. They can buy offsets to stay under that limit. And even when offsets have integrity, they don't actually result in at-source decarbonisation. Most of our offsets in Australia are from the land sector. I'm not going to get into the problems with them, but if you've got the industrial sector constantly relying on offsets from the land sector, that is placing more and more burden on our farmers or other people to try and find new ways to reduce their emissions just so the industry can maintain business as usual. I'm going to keep my points about the safeguard mechanism really high level. It's an unnecessarily complex bit of policy. That's not an accident, it's a coalition policy. It was never designed to reduce emissions. It was designed to give the illusion of regulatory accountability to the fossil fuel industry, and arguably it still does that. Yes, there have been some tweaks. There's something called a hard cap has been introduced, so that means that collectively facilities can't pollute above a certain level, which may impact whether new gas and coal projects can go ahead. But it's business as usual for existing facilities. So this is going to mean that there's a sort of a few there's a lot of administration. Oh no, really? Can I go for 2 more minutes? Is that all right? Thank you. Sorry, I was getting into the land sector accounting up the front. Okay, so I can speculate about how it will or won't work. Ultimately, it is now on the government to show how it will reduce emissions. Actually remains to be seen whether it will permanently reduce emissions. I'm going to skip over this bit. So where does this leave us, I suppose? In terms of the safeguard, yes, it remains to be seen whether it will result in decarbonisation, but there is now added scrutiny on the government to show every time it approves a new gas and coal project how we are getting closer to meeting our climate targets. That is a good thing. We're all watching now. You wanted this policy, you show us how it decarbonises. So to wrap up, Australia's climate policies, effective or greenwashing? Well, the ones I've just described leave us with a clean air electricity grid, but not much else. And we've still got plans for massive fossil fuel expansion. So the government suggests that its climate policies and programs will drive economy-wide decarbonisation. Outside of the safeguard mechanism, though, there is so much work to be done. Like, that's just 28% of our emissions. There's so much low-hanging fruit that needs to be tackled, whether it's public transport, energy efficiency, buildings, that remains to be seen whether we can decarbonise manufacturing, agriculture. There's no meaningful policies, although Josh and Michelle might disagree, that are adequately going to address this. What I would say is that the first thing for a climate policy to be effective is to do what the science says has to be done. What the IEA, the United Nations, the IPCC say all needs to be done, and that is to stop approving new fossil fuel projects. That is something I could legitimately say. That would be an effective climate policy, unequivocally. Thank you. Sorry to go over.
Okay, I'm going to be stuck with this one now. That's all right. Thank you very much, Polly. We will hold questions until after our MPs have had a chance to speak as well. Our next speaker for this evening will be Dr. Michelle Ananda-Rajah, who is MP for the seat of Higgins. And just to say, we are putting our MPs in alphabetical order. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Just before I start, I missed the acknowledgement to country, but I do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as you know, I belong to a government that is championing the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a modest ask of recognition and consultation. We are answering that call. And despite the negativity and relentless how would you even describe it? It's, I think, misinformation. I am confident that the Australian people will answer the call of the Uluru Statement. I'm so passionate about it, I could talk about it for the next 10 minutes. But I will say that, it will have a negligible, if any, impact on our lives, but it will have an outsized impact on the lives of our First Nations people. And now more than ever, don't we need their wisdom as we start, after a very long decade, a journey towards a decarbonised future and a low-emission economy. I will say this, I think, just to give you a bit of an overview, I don't want to speak for too long because I think we need to have time for Q&A, and I have to leave at about 7:40. I've got another event to get to. But I'll just say this, that the Industrial Revolution took 100 years, if not more. And it happened through gradual incrementalism. A bit like politics, actually. Politics is gradual incrementalism. Now, we are on the cusp of a second industrial revolution, the energy transformation, or energy transition, some people say. But we can't do this in 100 years. So this will happen at the pace of a digital transformation. And it's going to happen over the next 7 years as we go from 33% renewable energy now to 82% renewable energy in a mere 7 years. That in itself is absolutely massive for a nation like Australia, a country that has been a petrostate, has built its wealth on fossil fuels. We are a fossil fuel giant, there's no question about that, but we are transitioning to become an electrostate. And I'm absolutely confident that with this government and with a progressive parliament, that we are going to achieve that goal of becoming a renewable energy superpower. There's no question in my mind. What I will say, though, is that, we have had a decade of policy chaos on the energy front, and I completely understand that the Australian population, like a lot of the people here, are traumatised from the last 10 years. Indeed, I was too. And it was the motivation for me to leave my job, which was a very nice job in medicine. It was Josh Burns' fault, actually. He recruited me. And enter the political fray. And I've done it, with my eyes wide open, and we're here to roll up our sleeves. And on this side of the house, we don't get to crawl into the fetal position over climate change. There has been, I think, over the last decade, an industry of despair that has sprung up over this issue, and I understand why that has happened, but I don't get to trash talk Australia. I will never do that. And I'm absolutely confident that we are going to achieve our goals. But we do have some challenges ahead of us, and I just want to talk briefly about that, and I'll let Josh dig into the actual pillars of our policy. The pillars of the policy, broadly speaking, are essentially electrification. So tomorrow there will be an announcement around our national EV strategy. Transport accounts for about 20% of Australia's emissions, of which 85% are due to cars, light vehicles. The second pillar is the safeguard mechanism, a framework to decarbonise industry without deindustrialising Australia. All right, that's how I see it. And the third aspect is poles and wires, rewiring the nation. So everyone loves renewable energy, we love solar farms, we love large-scale offshore wind. We pretty much don't like the poles and wires. But you can't get to a renewable energy future without those poles and wires. And so we're investing $20 billion on rewiring the nation, which is essentially upgrading the grid on the east coast of Australia. And we've already started that. There's been disbursements in the order of tens of billions already to connect Tasmania to the mainland and have Tasmania export its energy to Australia, to the mainland. But we have some challenges, and achieving that decarbonised future, we have to address some bottlenecks. And it surprises me that this doesn't get discussed enough. And we're encountering the bottlenecks now. We're seeing this in our community. The first is a skills shortage. The second is addressing workforce participation, which relates to women. And the third is industrial capability. So with the skills shortage, aim or predict that we are going to be 12,000 workers short in the clean energy sector in by 2025. That's 2 years away, 12,000 workers short. So we have to upskill an entire workforce, young and old alike, to get this done. I'm talking about human capital. There's no shortage of the green stuff in your pockets. There's plenty of that washing around. The issue is human capital. The second thing is workforce participation. Now, women under the previous government were deprioritised. There's no question about that. There was no mention given in the last decade to women's economic development. And yet we're going to need to unleash women in order to get to net zero. We need all hands on deck to make this happen. And so we're investing in things like paid parental leave, cheaper childcare, which was the largest on-budget spend, $5 billion, in the October budget, and there'll be more to come in the May budget around this. We're also investing in modernising our workplaces to stamp out things like sexual harassment and victimisation so that women actually feel safe at work, and that was by implementing things like respect at work. All of this stuff matters in our journey to net zero. And the final thing is industrial capability. Now, Australia, to its enduring shame, is bottom of the heap when it comes to sovereign manufacturing capability. The OECD, a club of 38 rich countries, we are number 38. And this is based on a study from a few years ago from the Centre of Future Work. So, we aren't going to get to net zero unless we can build our own wind turbines, we can build those solar farms, we can create those large transmission cables, lay those undersea cables, those wires, those cables as thick as my arm, in order to get to net zero. We also have to invest in the R&D in order to create those future fuels, whether they be green methanol, green urea, ammonia, hydrogen, biofuels, sustainable aviation fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel, ladies and gentlemen, is made mainly from waste. It's made from algae. It's made from food waste, solid waste, human waste. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we need to invest in, and we are investing in order to get to net zero. So I would push back against the relentless negativity when it comes to climate. I think that we are on the cusp of an energy transformation, but we're not going to achieve that goal unless we invest in the human capital and the R&D to get there. And this is a journey, and we're just starting that journey now. But I don't get to crawl into the fetal position. I have to motivate and elevate people to believe that they should be part of this journey. Those 12,000 workers, at the moment, our clean energy sector only has about 40% women. So Australia signed a pledge called Equal by 30. Equal by 30 means that we want to see gender equity in our clean energy sector, which means we need to get to 50% men and women workers to be part of that green energy transition. So I actually think that the future is quite bright. I disagree with a lot of points made by the previous speaker, but I'm not going to go into picking them all apart. I think I just want to give you context that this journey to net zero is very much a whole of nation effort, and we have to address bottlenecks in order to achieve that goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'd now like to call on Josh Burns, who is the MP for the seat of Macnamara.
Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Polly, and of course, Michelle. It's a hard act to follow, two very impressive women, but I will make some brief remarks, and then I think in the interest of everyone being able to participate, I can see a few notebooks out, and a few people have said they want to ask questions, so I think we'll try and move on to that as quickly as possible. A couple of things to first of all say, though. I can't miss this opportunity to mention the fact that we are going to a referendum. And I know that tonight is about climate change, but this year is also about the referendum, and getting a chance to speak to all of you is not something I get every single day. So all I would say to you, and my sense is that Macnamara is going to have an extraordinarily high yes vote. But be a part of that, and be a part of the right side of history. And to think of the sort of people who are lining up on the other side of history, of Dutton and Hanson and Joyce and Clive Palmer, it's clearer in my mind that actually we have a pretty big-hearted community, and that, just as Michelle said, that we were not only going to be on the right side of history, but we are going to, with our ballot box, give something that First Nations people have asked for. Not what the government has put forward, but what First Nations people have asked for. And I implore you to be a part of the very first stage of the Uluru Statement from the Heart of a Voice to Parliament. Now, the last time I was on a climate forum, I was sitting next to a different person who's actually in the room, and Steph Hodgins-May, who was an annoyingly good candidate, who ran against me at the last election, also had a beautiful baby, Vivi, and I wish you and the family all the best, Steph. It's nice to see you. The way I would describe where we're at right now as a country on climate policy is that there is a big and difficult ship to manoeuvre, and we have to turn it around. And I think that if you stop and reflect for the fact that we have been in government for less than a year, there are some significant changes that have been made. And I understand that Polly has made some really poignant points about exports and about the production of fossil fuels, and many of them I agree with. But I also think that we need to get our own house in order to have legitimacy on the international stage. And I think that we haven't done that yet, and that while our targets have certainly improved, there is a significant amount of work to be done inside Australia in order for us to credibly be going around to other countries. And I'm not talking about China and India, but rather Japan and South Korea and other countries who are buying a majority of our exports and who, on a whole range of strategic levels, have a lot to do with Australia, to be able to credibly say, here is how we move forward together. So how do we do that? How do we actually get our country in order? And I want to just mention a couple of things that we've done already. In the first few weeks of returning to Parliament, we passed a climate change law, which I've had, and looking around this room, I've spoken about that bill with many of you. But one of the things that bill did was align all of the different funds that Australia has, all of the major funds like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, like ARENA, like the North Australia Infrastructure Fund, to ensure that every dollar that Australia spends by independent government agencies are not manipulated like what Angus Taylor wanted them to do, but are directed towards renewable energy, directed towards low-emission technology, and directed away from exploration of the Beetaloo gas basin and towards renewable energy. And so how do we measure the fact that actually we're turning that big ship around? Well, you only have to look at the number of applications of major new renewable energy projects inside Australia and the pace at which we are approving those renewable energy projects to clearly demonstrate the fact that something is happening. Something is happening in Australia where the previous trajectory of Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison is ended, and we are now seeing a significant increase in the amount of low-emission technology, not only being applied for, being invested in, but being approved by the federal government. The other thing I wanted to touch on, and I believe tonight's all about the safeguard mechanism, so I won't sort of dwell on it, but I'll just make this point about the safeguard mechanism, is that it is the most significant lever that government's ever tried to pull in the history of our country on climate change. I mean, the Gillard and Rudd governments were able to reduce our emissions by about 11% over the sort of 6 years that we were in government. Well, the safeguard mechanism is trying to replicate that in and of itself over the next 7. So it is a significant policy lever, and we have to get it right. It was very important that we put the foundations in place, and they, I think, will be adjusted over time. But I also think that one thing is important, is that one of the messages I received from the election from our community, and I think the country as well, is that the way in which politics is practiced is really important. And the way in which government engages on policy is really important. And there has been quite a bit of commentary about, you know, the climate discussions, but the truth is that there were really good faith discussions. And there were really good faith discussions between the government, the Greens and the crossbench. And that's how it should be. And to be frank, I don't say it with any great joy that Liberal Party has completely vacated this space. It's just a fact, and we have to move on without them. But in fact, we would sit down with anyone in the Parliament who represents communities around the country. They are the ones who excluded themselves. But we don't seek to try and shut down debate. In fact, I think the processes around the climate change bill and the safeguard mechanism has been one of extremely healthy politics, of disagreement, of public debate, but one of outcomes. where we all get quite a bit of what we want and we move on to the next big issue, which I think this year will, as much as Chris Bowen would love me to announce all of the details of electric vehicle policy, I would get a very stroppy phone call after this, is around environmental reform. And how does that intersect with our climate policy? We are about to embark on the major environmental law reform in this country, the EPBC Act review. And we mentioned First Nations voices at the start of our remarks. Well, that is going to be one of the key aspects of the Reform EPBC Act, as is community consultation, as is actually having the communities having more of a say in environmental projects. There is going to be a whole suite of reforms, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a community meeting like this about them in the not too distant future. But the way in which our climate policy actually talks to those EPBC Acts, and in the other way around any new approval, which doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm not necessarily talking about coal and gas, in fact I'm not, I'm talking about things like lithium, I'm talking about things like iron ore and others that we're going to need to produce products to create renewable energy. It's really important that our environmental reforms are strengthened at a national level. What the previous government tried to do was to absorb all responsibility on environmental reform and give it back to the states. We can't do that. We won't do that. And in fact, we're about to lift the standards of environmental legislation in this country. I encourage you all to be a part of that, and many people in the audience have already had discussions around it. But it is an extremely important piece of reform around the way in which we look after our natural environment, or whether we industrialise some of the most sacred parts of our country. So I would say to you, my honest appraisal is this, that the electorate that I represent, and dare I say it, the electorate that my friend Dr. Ananda-Rajah represents, are ones where every time people raise their voice with me, not necessarily at me, but with me, sometimes at me, but every time people in our community raise questions, concerns, or even civil society engages in constructive ways, it means that there is in no doubt in my colleagues where I stand on issues, and I think, dare I say, Michelle. But there is also a clear sense of what Macnamara stands for, and I think that's really important. Macnamara is a place where we demand climate action, and I agree with Polly that there is a lot more work to be done. But I have a bit of hope, and I have a bit of ambition, and I have a lot of work that I want to get done on behalf of this community, so I thank you for being here tonight. I look forward to a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to, microphone's up here. Thank you very much, Josh and Michelle, for those presentations. I think we all do understand that the job of being an MP and being in the government is super challenging. There are so many priorities to balance, and the climate debate has been a really vexed space for that last 10 years, as has been discussed as well. So we do appreciate that. We also appreciate that individual MPs have their own perspectives, have their own electorates, and that you're both working in electorates which are very progressive and which are really advocating for you to go stronger and faster, and know that, you know, while we can see the progress that the government has made since the election, that I guess as a community and as a community action group, we also see it as our role to be pushing you harder and faster, and we'll be cheering you on to do that and continuing to help support that work as well, as much as what we can. Now, Zoe Daniel sent her sincere apologies this evening. She was committed elsewhere some time ago, but she did prepare a video for us, which we'll play for you now.
Thank you. I'll begin by acknowledging the Bunurong or Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and elders past and present who are in the room tonight, and acknowledge that this is unceded Aboriginal land at the beginning of a very important period of conversation for our communities and our nation. And I state my support for the voice. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person tonight due to a long-standing commitment within our community, but I do wish to acknowledge the importance of your three organisations to the Goldstone community. The work you've been doing for years in drawing attention to and seeking action on matters of environmental concern in this part of Melbourne is one of the reasons that I was able to mount a successful campaign to enter the federal parliament. Without your efforts, it's unlikely you would now have a community independent member of parliament to represent the interests and concerns of the people I'm now sworn to represent. Since I've been elected, I've been determined to advance action to minimise climate change at the national level, as well as being involved in efforts to improve the amenity and environment in the neighbourhoods in which we live. For example, immediately after the election, I made representations, along with Josh Burns MP, to Ministers Catherine King and Tanya Plibersek to ensure the incoming government met its financial commitment to the master plan for the redevelopment of the Yalukit-Willam Reserve to improve biodiversity. I've also been extensively briefed by the South East Council's Climate Change Alliance and addressed their functions on shared concerns about the state of Port Phillip Bay and other related matters. On that front, I've begun to engage with federal, state and local politicians, including Josh again, whose electorates border the bay from Frankston to Williamstown and beyond, to see what can be done to resolve the conflicting responsibilities between the three tiers of government that are acting as barriers to progress on managing the bay, including water quality, pollution, erosion, and transitioning our approach to the bay to seeing it as an ecosystem. This is very much a work in progress. I've also been actively engaged with the Bayside and Glen Eira councils to encourage them to step up the number and, even more importantly, the location of fast chargers so that a community which has among the highest concentration of EVs in the country does not have to hang around some isolated piece of council property to charge an electric vehicle. More ambitiously, since before the election, my team and I have been working on a community electrification zero waste and environment pilot project we call Village Zero, which began following discussions with the Sandy Village Traders Association and the assistance of local philanthropic groups like Uncommon Folk and Regen Melbourne, as well as the Bayside and Glen Eira councils. This project sits within the Electrify Everything approach advocated by Saul Griffith, who argues very convincingly about the need to combine electrification and community renewal. Our initiative would see a series of batteries taking locally generated solar power and reusing it within the community during the evening peak. In the longer term, the aim is for it to reduce the pressure on the electricity grid, drive down prices, and help us to help the planet. It's a project that's already taken hundreds of hours of work by me and my team, including meetings with Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen, discussions with ARENA, and indeed with other interested MPs and the surrounding councils. In conjunction with Bayside, the Australian National University Battery and Grid Integration Team, Acacia Energy and Renew Melbourne, together we are working to get funding for this ambitious project, and I would argue it's essential. Goldstein has the potential to provide a community model for distributed electrification that could be adopted elsewhere, just as Saul Griffith advocates. Village Zero represents true action: climate, community, local and personal. We saw it at our recent Community Energy Expo at Brighton Town Hall, attended by hundreds of people. We need a bigger venue next time. That just really demonstrated how much community support there is for this kind of action. Now to the bigger picture. I argued during the election campaign that Labor's 2030 target of a 43% reduction in carbon emissions was too low to ensure that we as a nation could get to net zero by mid-century. I still believe that, and so do most reputable experts. With that in mind, I and the other community crossbenchers have been pressing the government to be more ambitious. We have had some success. For example, when the government announced its decision to legislate the 43% target, I was able to convince Minister Bowen that it should be explicitly a floor, not a ceiling, and it is now legislated in that way. And I appreciate the way the minister's been prepared to consider these and other climate matters of concern to the Goldstein community, even though currently the crossbench does not hold the balance of power in the House of Reps. It's a small but significant change because it goes to ambition. It gives the government no hiding place. It makes complacency that much harder. I also engaged extensively with the Minister and the Prime Minister on the Safeguard Mechanism legislation. If the Climate Change Bill was an expression of good intentions, the Safeguard Mechanism legislation is about action. In the end, I voted for it, even though I continue to have doubts about whether it will do as much as the government claims to force the nation's biggest commercial polluters, contributing fully 28% of our emissions, to clean up their act. With that in mind, with transparency and accountability as my priorities, I proposed a number of amendments to the Minister and eventually to the Parliament. The first was to bring forward the timetable for reporting on just how effective the legislation and its regulations had been in reducing emissions from these sectors from 2026-27 to 2025. My argument was that 26-27 would be too late to enable remedial action should it be required, and that the authorities would have sufficient data by 2025 to take the steps needed to ensure these big polluters do what is actually required. But as I said in my second reading speech in the House, the safeguard legislation raises a big question, and that is whether it's really about incentivising polluters to reduce their emissions or fostering creative accounting that allows them to offset their way out of doing so. This is a particular concern when it comes to sunset industries in the fossil fuel sector. Gas and coal companies may be incentivised to go for broke to profit while they can, buying unlimited carbon credits to offset their pollution until they phase out. Carbon credits that may not even reduce emissions as they're claimed to. Experts have long raised concerns about the integrity of Australia's carbon credits. Some of these concerns have to do with additionality. That is, that carbon credits are being issued for projects where the emissions reduction activities would have happened anyway, without the incentive of credits. This means that companies purchasing carbon credits can claim they're reducing their emissions when in fact there's no net reduction taking place. This is particularly dangerous under the safeguard mechanism, where Australia's biggest polluters will be allowed to purchase unlimited offsets for their millions of tonnes of emissions that don't truly offset anything. The government commissioned a recently completed Chubb review into the integrity of Australia's carbon credits, and it recommended that projects issued with carbon credits meet requirements that, if adopted, would go a long way to address their present lack of integrity. The Minister has declared that the government supports all 16 Chubb recommendations in principle. Therefore, I proposed amendments to the legislation concerning two of the methods for which Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs, are issued: human-induced regeneration and the landfill gas method. The amendments were consistent with the recommendations made by the Chubb review, as I said, recommendations this government has already agreed to in principle. On human-induced regeneration, my amendment was very detailed, but in effect would have excluded carbon credits where land was never cleared in the first place. On landfill gas projects that capture and destroy methane from landfill, my amendment was designed to stop projects from double dipping under concessional arrangements agreed by the previous government, in effect getting free money. These amendments were about integrity, true integrity. There is also a deep disconnect between the legislation and approving new coal and gas developments. I do understand the government's argument that for several years gas will be needed as we ramp up renewable energy, fix the grid and enable extraction of critical minerals essential for the development of cleaner technologies. But this must not be a smokescreen for projects which are not going to aid in a transition to renewable energy, but instead serve to maintain the dominance of the fossil fuel industry. In the end, the Minister did not accept my amendments. I did pass them on, though, to Senator David Pocock, who had expressed similar concerns. In the Senate, the government did make amendments in relation to carbon credits, which it claimed would have a similar effect to what I was proposing, and which Senator Pocock accepted. We will see. One thing of which you can be certain, I will be watching all of this like a hawk, or maybe a wedge-tailed eagle, to do all I can to ensure that this most important legislation does what the government claims it will. That is, to ensure that these biggest of polluters cannot account their way to zero, that they make real cuts and change the way they go about their business, so we really have a fighting chance of achieving what we need for the health of our environment, the health of our community, for biodiversity, for our aspirations for the future prosperity of our nation and all the people on the planet. There is more to do. Soon we will see the government's electric vehicle strategy and fuel quality plans. Changes to biodiversity and environmental laws are also ahead. As your independent for Goldstein, I'm here to hold the government to account. I hope your deliberations tonight are a success. Thank you.
Thank you in absentia to Zoe and team for putting the video together. That's very much appreciated. Now, we will take questions from the floor for our speakers, but I do note that Michelle does need to leave early, so I'm hoping to just ask you one question before you leave. 5 minutes? Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Just so we can put one question to you perhaps before you go. I'm wondering, Michelle, so by background, you're a medical specialist, and I think prior to entering politics, you would have worked at least in part through the COVID pandemic and seen how the world responded to the pandemic when presented with an immediate emergency in the here and now, in the development of the medicines, vaccines, antivirals, how quickly it responded. I did my PhD in drug development science, and I know how long it takes and the work that goes into developing medicines. And to accelerate that process to the length of time that it took was just incredible. If the world were to take climate in a similar way and Australia to accept that level of emergency, what would our response look like? And perhaps you might like to comment as well from a human health perspective, which I know you have an interest in the climate impacts on human health, on how framing climate as a health emergency as well might help to push us go further and faster.
So there's no question that we're in a climate emergency, and I think it's also no surprise that we've had a pandemic at this point in humanity's history. What we're seeing around the world is a acceleration of zoonoses. So this is animal to human diseases, basically, and climate change is going to accelerate that. We've seen an ingress of Japanese encephalitis into Australia. This is a disease which I only read about in textbooks, and for most of my career, I just counselled people to avoid mosquitoes when they went travelling. That was it. Didn't really expect anyone to need to get vaccinated, or certainly did not expect it to end up in Australia. And last year we saw it happen with the floods. So Japanese encephalitis is now endemic in Australia. It's no joke. There's no treatment for it either. Climate change and the climate emergency, and I said this in my maiden speech, is a threat multiplier. It will put pressure on every single system and every single sector of society, which is why you need a whole of society approach to dealing with this. You don't come at this just from the energy sector or from climate policy. You come at this from health, from transport, from R&D, from manufacturing, and also you have to invest in human capital, and that means playing the long game. Education is playing the long game. We need people with the right skills and determination in order to get to net zero. And that's not a trivial ask. So when people say to me, I agree with you that the COVID pandemic galvanized pharma, essentially, backed by the US government, who poured billions, an unprecedented amount of money into COVID vaccine research. But that was a scientific problem. And a scientific problem is easy to solve. It's basically creating a vaccine for COVID or creating a vaccine for smallpox. The climate emergency is not just a scientific problem, and I think this is the mistake people have been making for too long, that this is also a social problem as much as a political problem. And this is why it has not been solved for so long. We've had gridlock in this country, gridlock in the United States as well, and it's only changed with change of political leadership. I mean, the US is a great example, decades of gridlock, and Congress have now started to move. Why? Because the Biden administration had passed a suite of policies, the Infrastructure Reduction, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Jobs and Skills Act, and another really big act, which I cannot remember, but essentially it's 3.6 trillion Australian dollars of money, which is now tilting the US towards decarbonisation. And that is a huge opportunity for Australia. It also does present some challenges, particularly for our green energy, green hydrogen industry. But I'll stop there.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Michelle, and we do appreciate your contribution to tonight's forum. Okay, we will now take questions from the floor for our speakers. There are a couple of microphones available. Also, please note that in the interests of time, we are only allowing about 30 seconds for the questions, so please keep your questions as concise as possible.
Hi, my name is Gillian Rose, and I'd like to ask this question to Josh Burns. I would like to know why we are still, or ever, subsidising the fossil fuel industry.
Good question, Gillian. Thank you for it. So the big figure that gets bandied around is a fuel subsidy for diesel fuel for large vehicles who don't use the roads, and it is a point of discussion in government that's the sort of worth billions of dollars of the federal government's budget. But beyond that, we have systematically taken money away from subsidising fossil fuels in towards renewable energy, and there is a complete alignment across government funds to direct every dollar that we can of public funds towards renewable energy, and whether that's through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, through the Rewiring the Nation, the transmission project, the amount of dollars that we are spending on renewable energy is increasing, and through electric vehicles, charging stations, etc. So I would say to you that the diesel fuel excise is an old policy, and it's one where it's designed for cars that are not on the main roads, and it's not my favourite policy, but I am very comfortable with the fact that we have done a lot of work taking money out of fossil fuel projects and putting them into renewables, and will continue to do so.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, Polly.
In relation to that?
Sure.
So we've got the budget coming up. Does that mean that you're going to take the $1.9 billion that the government gave to Middle Arm, that is the same amount of money as the entire Powering the Regions fund?
Thank you for the question, Polly. So Middle Arm. So I'm planning on going to. Is that a bit better? It's fine. It's fine. Okay. Sounds a bit feedbacky up here. I'm planning on going to Middle Arm in the coming weeks. Essentially, the conversation that I'm having in government, because I have raised the concerns of many groups who are raising the concerns of Middle Arm, around Middle Arm. The facilities that are being built at the Middle Arm facility are designed to be able to deal with the ideal exports of the future. So if you are going to export hydrogen, the particles are much smaller, and in order to be able to use existing infrastructure, you need to be able to modify it and get ready for, ideally, the sort of exports that we are going into the future. There is nothing in Middle Arm going towards a fossil fuel company. And I want to be able to reassure people as much as I can, and I am planning on going there. But I would also say that there is a difference between building infrastructure to be able to plan for the future of green energy and green hydrogen exports, which is, hydrogen is a pretty combustible particle, and it can't escape from the pipes, otherwise it will go kaboom. So we need to be able to build facilities that are able to deal with that and plan for that, and that's what Middle Arm's about.
My question maybe to you, Polly, about who is going to dictate the culture or the mythology of Australian green transition? Because current mediascape is not helping the ambitions that we have, and also about intergenerational justice, maybe also migrants or people who live here but cannot vote. I feel that many groups of Australian society are excluded from our ambitious green transition, and how do we embrace those people, or what can we do so people are included in the big plans that we're talking about today?
That's an enormous question. To answer the first part, who is going to, I suppose, is it craft the narrative? Is given that the media is generally, I suppose, becoming less reliable. But that said, the coalition government was master of the three-word slogan, jobs and growth, meeting and beating, and I think gas-led recovery. It didn't stick. I think authenticity has far more cut through. The truth has far more cut through, and in the moment, that's cold comfort, because all you see is sort of, Peter Dutton is getting so much coverage for The Voice and things like that, and the slogans do stick, but I think ultimately you're left with a residue of truth. Australia has... People know Australia has cheated on climate for the last several decades. Internationally, that's known. Actually, if anyone's going to have an accurate view of how Australia has behaved, it's Pacific Island nations and internationally. And I have a lot of conversations with embassies, and I was recently in New York, and I hope to absolve myself for those omissions from the flights, but I had meetings with people at the UN. They know what Australia's doing. They know what Australia's done. They know what Australia is not doing. It's hard to see, day to day, but it is on the record. In terms of the people who don't have official voices, in terms of who can't vote, I think those people are still making noise. I hope this isn't sort of placatory, but joining advocacy organisations, making noise, influencing people that can vote, influencing conversations like tonight, I think has been incredibly powerful. And some of those conversations, the school strike for climate, I'm sure that influenced the last election. And while we do have a Labor majority, and I'm sorry, Josh, I hope we have a Labor minority, not because I don't like Labor, but I think because it brings more voices to the table. And so we have a Labor minority, but a Labor majority, but the 2022 election was a vote for a climate majority, and it was because of those strikes and conversations like this and events, and dare I say it, even Twitter, which I know is a pretty gross place right now, but social media is incredibly powerful. I don't know if that's an adequate answer. It's kind of all philosophical, but is it at all helpful?
But there are programs for people who live in apartment buildings.
Oh, you mean like literally emissions reduction? It's probably beyond the scope of what I can answer. You can always contact the Australia Institute and we can help provide answers. But yeah, like renters have really limited voices when it comes to getting solar panels on it. I'm really sorry, I misinterpreted your question. I thought it was how do asylum seekers vote for climate? Legitimately, I thought that's what it was. Sorry.
I was going to agree with Polly too that yes, join your local climate action group, but your local council would also be a good area, a good place to start with some of those queries around apartment living and sustainability and access to different measures to address that.
Thank you, and thanks to all the speakers for making time. Really appreciate it. I feel like I've been told tonight that I'm enjoying being in despair, and I can tell you absolutely I'm not. I hate being in despair. I actually want to be positive and I want to see a really good future. I feel like I just can't get there. Polly, I just wanted to ask you, if you could pick out a couple of issues to rebut from Josh's excellent speech, just to shed some light on gas in particular and the new project's role in exports rather than our domestic use.
Yeah, so I tend to agree. I felt like it diminishes, just to start off with, this is not negativity. What we're bringing tonight is not negativity. I see it as terror. No, I'm serious. Being told that, oh, there's too much negativity about Australia's climate policies. No, sorry, it's not negativity. This is an existential threat. And I've just found out that now we've got Japanese encephalitis like circulating throughout Australia. Climate change is science, you know, and we know what's causing it, and we know what can slow it down. We can't stop it, and that's stopping fossil fuels. So to be called negative, I think, really strips us of what is very justified rage and fear and despair. It's not negativity, it's just frustration, and this is not going to Josh's point, but also to say that this is more than a government effort. Yeah, okay, we've done our bit. We voted for climate action in 2022. Where is government? Like, we voted for leadership, we voted for climate integrity, we voted for climate ambition. Where is it if we've got a government that is saying it's irresponsible to ban new gas and coal projects, and they're not part of the transition? It takes about 10 years to get a new gas or coal project up. They're not part of the critical transition. We've got enough of gas. In terms of exports, I guess, you know, I take Josh's point, we've got to clean up our own act, but it's not either or. We can be saying Australia has a ban on fossil fuel exports at the same time as cleaning up our act. And that is leadership, because that is a really bold thing to do. And yeah, it might, you know, there will be diplomatic conversations to have there. But again, this is not opinion. I don't have an ideological position against gas and coal. It is the science. We just have to stop producing it, and we have to stop burning it. I said this before, you know, and Josh, you said, you know, I was conflating the domestic and the exported emissions. But when we produce gas and coal for export, that is significant emissions onshore too, right? There's a lot of emissions that come up from reservoirs and things like that, and we're not going to get them with carbon capture and storage. So I'm going to rebut one more point, and again, I'm sorry, it's Michelle's, not Josh's, but we were told how hard this is going to be. You know, we're turning this massive ship around, and, you know, we've got to find women to work in jobs and lots of people to work in the clean energy sector. Yeah, that's all a really big task, but why aren't we tackling that low-hanging fruit first? Australia is the only developed country in the world that is a deforestation hotspot. We're the world's third largest fossil fuel exporter. Why are we not tackling those easy things first? Because there is a lot of really hard work to do after the fact.
Thank you, Polly. Have we got our next question ready to go? Wendy, in the back.
Hello, my name's Wendy Cox. I'm a member of LEAN, Labor Environment Action Network. My question is, I'm actually a big fan of cap limits that reduce down. So I'm wondering whether we could implement one on political donations, especially from the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Wendy. 2 points to make. We're currently in the process of reforming our whole electoral law system, including donations, and we are looking at a range of issues around more transparency and also potentially looking at spending caps as well. But they're all being considered by a parliamentary committee at the moment and the minister. Personally, I don't take donations from fossil fuels, and I know obviously the Labor Party does, and I'm not trying to hide that, but I think that that's where we need to get to, and I'd like to see more of my colleagues take that position. If I can say one small thing around deforestation, that the regional forestry agreements won't be exempt from the upcoming EPBC Act review.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Wendy. Next question. Yes.
Just one comment to start with. Mind blown, Goldstein more progressive than McNamara. How long is that going to be the case? But look, I am frustrated, terrified, upset, all those things. 2006, we started the Bayside Climate Change Action Group, 17 years ago. So we're still waiting for a government that will stop approving new coal and gas. How long, Paulie, am I going to have to wait?
That was very, very nicely handled, Polly. Look, since coming to government, there's been 2 approvals, major approvals, that have gone to the Minister for the Environment on fossil fuels. There's been a lot more that's gone around renewables, and they've pretty much all been approved. There's been 6 major renewable energy projects that have been approved. In terms of fossil fuels, for the first time in Australia's history, Tanya Plibersek blocked Clive Palmer's coal mine. So the answer to your question is that that's the first time that that's ever happened. And I hope that we have environmental laws that are able to give the Minister for the Environment more tools to be able to do that many, many more times in the future. The only other approval was around an existing gas wells, where there was an approval of 113 gas wells in a sort of current existing site of around 8,000, which that is what it is, right? And I'm just trying to be honest and transparent with you. But I do think that the environmental approval system, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, what was your name? Sorry, Tim. Is crucial, and we need to take responsibility at a federal level for national environmental standards. And if we don't do that, then the tools that people like Tanya Plibersek will have at her disposal will be extremely limited. And I don't want to have history making firsts. I want a more sustainable future. Yep.
Thank you, Josh. Just time, I think, for 2 more questions.
Can I just grab your mic for a minute, just while you're waiting for the next question? The Australia Institute has a website called Coal Mine Tracker. There's 28 coal mines currently waiting for approval by Tanya Plibersek, so you can keep an eye on that yourself and see whether they go through. I think there's one coming up for approval in the next couple of weeks. So.
Okay, this one's for Josh, and I'll preface by saying, Labor's obviously constrained by some electoral portion from the defeat in 2019 and the situation leading up to the 2022 election. And obviously, ideally, they want to get action without getting kicked out of office for it. So my question is, how do we move forward at an accelerated pace? How do we empower the government to actually take accelerated action? I recognise some progress has been made, but we're in a crisis and it really needs to accelerate. How do we shift the dial so that Labor can actually make the change that's really needed, because it's not there yet, and move forward?
What was your name? Sorry.
Asha.
Great question, Asha. And it's not an easy thing to be able to try and gauge political support across the entire country. We lost a lot of elections, and we were watching really destructive politicians hold our country back. I do have hope, and I do think you're going to see an acceleration of policy. We're about to make some major announcements tomorrow, and I would definitely encourage you to keep an eye out as another major step forward. And then the EPBC Act is going to significantly improve our legislative capabilities as well. It's not the end of it. This is the start of the journey. We've been in power for 10 months, and I think that there is goodwill. I think the Aston by-election would have given people a lot of confidence to say that actually the Australian people want to give us a shot at trying to implement a range of policies. And climate change is a big part of that, because we have been certainly doing things differently to the previous government. And the other thing I would say to you, that what I say to my colleagues around climate ambition is not one member of Parliament in 2022 lost to someone who was offering a smaller emission reduction target. Not one. In the 151 seats around the country, everyone lost to someone offering more. If that's not a big, clear slap in the face to political parties, I don't know what is. So I will keep pushing. I do think there is good policy on the horizon, and we will keep working as hard as we can to try and make it happen as quickly as possible. But thank you for the question, Tim.
Thank you. Just one last question.
My name's David Prince, resident of Glenara and McNamara. Even with some short-term caps, we're seeing projected electricity price increases of 20, 30, 40% or more in the winter. We're seeing affordability issues for residents, for small businesses. How do we ensure continued affordability alongside climate policy?
Do you want to do the other question as well?
My name is Todd Levi. I live opposite the Ellicott Willem Reserve, which is a great thing. But along with the grounds of this school is on track to be underwater in about 50, 60 years if we don't get our act together. Just want to make that point. I'm actually asking my question, not so much a question, Josh, but for a commitment to regulate these schemes up the wazoo, because we're talking huge amounts of money, and wherever there are huge amounts of money, there's going to be people queuing up to rort it. Can we have some serious oversight, as in better than what's happened with the NDIS over all these offset schemes?
Yeah.
Will you give us that commitment to fight for it?
Yeah. As much as I, Todd, as much as I like giving commitments that my colleagues don't necessarily listen to them all the time, but I do think, Todd, that what we are going to see and what we are seeing is, take the safeguard mechanism, for example, when we commissioned a review by the former chief scientist, Mr. Chubb, that when the recommendations were put forward around how do we improve offset and the ACCUs around the offsets, that we accepted all of the recommendations. I also think that, as I said in the speech, that we've tried to engage in good faith with a range of players, and I heard what Zoe Daniel said around transparency, and I think it's extremely important, and the way in which we got an outcome that I think has strengthened the safeguard mechanism program to ensure that more people have oversight on the large emitters will have a very strong regulator involved in all of that. So in terms of regulation of public funds, we put it in law that all of our funds have to be moving towards our climate target, and we won't be seeing a dismantling of ARENA and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and all of these huge financial instruments under our watch. And I think that there has been good governance and across a range of factors that have been returned since in the last 10 months. On the affordability of electricity, it is wrong to say that the electricity and gas prices in Australia have been due to renewable energy. The affordability issues that businesses and manufacturers have faced has been predominantly due to the fact that our gas exporters have been able to sell a predominant amount of Australian gas at hugely increased prices because Europe won't buy Russian gas. And that has meant that Australian gas prices have been exorbitant. Now, watch this space. Watch this space in the budget, and I think that these are Australian resources, and at the very worst case scenario, we should be taxing them at an adequate rate. And Stephen, the answer to your question about affordability is to try and provide businesses and homes with access to the cheapest form of electricity, which is not nuclear energy as the Ted O'Brien and Peter Dutton coalition are putting forward. It's renewable energy backed by some form of dispatchable energy, by batteries and hydro. And we are currently sitting in a state that's on average powered by about 30-35% renewable energy. We need to turn that around extremely quickly. The way that that's going to be happening is through wind farms, offshore wind farms, large-scale solar through areas like Mildura, and then connecting those things into the grid with some form of dispatchable energy. So we regulated the gas industry. We're going to be giving more electricity subsidies and cost of living relief in the upcoming budget, but we need to transition as quickly as we can to the cheapest form of energy, which is solar and wind backed by some form of dispatchable energy.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you. Thank you for all your questions, and I do apologise for not being able to get to all of those, but understanding, and Josh has got a young family to get home to, and we do all respect family time. Before we finish, though, we would like to propose and have you, as our audience, vote on a resolution that our 3 host organisations drafted regarding the next steps and what we can do as community groups to follow up on this really important issue. Thanks, Josh. So if you'd like to read this first slide here. So we, citizens of the electorates of Higgins, McNamara, Goldstein and surrounds, acknowledge that the amended safeguard mechanism, now legislated, has greatly enhanced the likelihood that Australia will meet its target of 43% emissions reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Yet we are mindful of science-based advice that deeper emissions cuts are required this decade for Australia to do its fair share in holding global warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold as described in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Therefore, we resolve to actively monitor the effectiveness of the government's climate policy and advocate to our federal MPs, firstly, if the policy does not meet its stated goals, and secondly, for changes to national policy as may be necessary to step up to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. We further call for the climate action networks in our area to continue to collaborate with other networks and to reassemble in 12 to 18 months' time with our federal MPs to report back to the community on progress towards these goals. And we do this with the overarching aim of securing a safe, livable and sustainable future for all Australians. All those in favour? That looks pretty unanimous from where I'm standing. Fantastic, thank you. So that's passed. So, okay. Thank you again, finally, to all of our speakers this evening. Josh, who's just exiting the building, but Polly Hemming from the Australia Institute again. Huge thank you for travelling all this way to speak to us this evening. For that dissection of government climate policy. We do really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Polly. Thank you to our MPs, Dr. Michelle Ananda-Rajah, Josh Burns, and thank you also to Zoe and her team for her time in preparing her video message for us tonight. As a token of our appreciation, we will be forwarding all of our speakers a special memento of the forum, so look out in the post in the next week or so. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Elwood Secondary College for the use of the Phoenix Theatre this evening. Thank you also to our organising committee and volunteers in promoting and putting on tonight's forum. And a big thank you to you, our audience, for coming along tonight. Thank you all. Good evening.